You up for listening to a bit of music?
Yeah.
Here's a little number. It's amazing.
Good group.
And today, we are here to talk about one of the most misunderstood genres, black metal. It has one of the most genuinely dark and disturbing histories in all of alternative music. Some of the founding members of the genre went to prison for burning churches, being involved with murders. There's an entire subgenre of Nazi black metal. Bands are known to throw dead animals off the stage. It's not exactly the most accessible thing, and it's certainly not something you would expect to get attention from people who don't even like metal, right? And yet, I would say black metal gets more attention from the media and other people outside of metal than any other part of the scene. There's the feature film Lords of Chaos. Deaf Heaven showed up in an Apple keynote. There's Kourtney Kardashian in a Mayhem long sleeve. There's even a black metal themed KFC commercial.
Oh man, that is hot.
KFC's new Wicked Crunch Big Box meal may be more heat than you can handle.
You'll also notice that media outlets like Vice that normally don't touch any kind of underground metal with a 10-foot pole give a surprising amount of coverage to black metal. And yet, despite all of that attention and media coverage, I think you could make the case that it is the only genre of metal that still really truly wants to stay underground. And so the question is, what's going on here? Why are people so fascinated by the genre? And has black metal been totally co-opted and commercialized by the likes of Apple and KFC? Or is it the last stand for underground metal? Those are the questions that I will try to answer in this video. And also, I'd like to thank Factor for sponsoring this video. If you're busy this fall but you still want to eat well, and you should, then check out Factor. They make nutritious, chef-prepared meals delivered straight to your door that are ready in just 2 minutes. That means you can skip the trip to the grocery store and the chopping and the prep and the cleanup and all that, while still getting the flavor and nutrition that you need. And if you eat out a lot, it's a great way to save money. It's way cheaper than takeout, or even worse, getting delivery, which honestly, I think is a complete ripoff. And they have a ton of options. Personally, I like Calorie Smart, which is less than 550 calories per serving, but they also have new lunch-to-go meals that are ready to eat with no microwave required, and their fancy new surf and turf options. Personally, I love that I don't have to think about what I'm gonna have for lunch. I just go downstairs, grab something out of the fridge, and I know that it's gonna taste good and I'm still gonna hit my macro goals. So if you wanna check out Factor, and honestly, I think you should, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use the code PUNK50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. And just to provide some context here for anybody who may not be familiar, let me start with a quick history of black metal. The term black metal comes from Venom's 1982 album of the same name, which kicked off the so-called first wave of black metal bands, including Hellhammer, Merciful Fate, and in my opinion, especially Bathory. But back then, black metal wasn't really a defined sound the way it would later become. It was more about the band's imagery and lyrical themes, which focused on the occult and really overtly satanic ideas. And of course, that sort of imagery wasn't a new thing in metal. Black Sabbath, for example, had been doing that stuff since the very beginning, or more recently, on a more sort of commercial level, Motley Crue's first album, Shout at the Devil, and bands like Wasp used a lot of imagery with pentagrams and that sort of thing. But to anybody who sort of knew what they were looking at, it never really felt like they were actual Satanists. It just felt like kind of cheesy shock value imagery. But with bands like Venom and Merciful Fate, it was much darker, more sinister, and it felt like maybe they actually meant it with songs like In League with Satan. Looking at it in the context of when it came out in 1982, it was like pretty scary stuff. You can imagine reading that and being like, wow, maybe they are really part of some evil satanic cult. Of course, as we realized in hindsight, they weren't. At least in the case of Venom, it was really just a more extreme version of Kiss or Motley Crue's shock value imagery. As Kronos from Venom said years later, we used subjects like Satanism and paganism to entertain people like horror movies do. Listening to a Venom album is the same thing as watching an Evil Dead movie. I don't go around murdering virgins in my spare time. And so even though though the bands themselves may not have taken it that seriously, that didn't stop them from influencing thousands of people all over the world who did take it seriously. Bands like Sarcophago in Brazil, as well as Profanatica and Vaughn in America, among many others, took what they were doing and just made it more extreme in every way. More intense music, more aggressively satanic imagery, just everything cranked up to 10. And most notably among all of them was the so-called second wave of bands from Norway. These are the names you've probably heard of from all the various books and documentaries about black metal: Mayhem, Darkthrone, Dissection, Emperor, Burzum, Immortal, all those bands. Musically, they were much more extreme than Venom or Bathory, with deliberately raw, harsh recordings. But what really set these bands apart, in my opinion, is that they had a much more coherent philosophy and worldview than the first wave of bands, who really didn't have much more of an agenda other than to shock people. For one, that initial second wave clique of Norwegian black metal bands really appeared to be true believers in Satanism, or at least anti-Christianity. Members of bands like Mayhem, Burzum, and Emperor went so far as to burn down several churches because they believed that those churches were monuments to the Christians that had invaded Norway, and in their view destroyed true indigenous Norwegian culture. And as you've probably heard of, Varg Vikernes from Burzum went to prison for killing Euronymous of Mayhem. The singer of Dissection was also convicted of being involved with the murder of a gay man and also went to prison. There were some other people who took their own lives. I mean, this is some really, really dark stuff. And they had that same level of intensity when it comes to their vision of what they thought the metal scene should be, and really saw themselves as like the ultimate gatekeepers. As Dead from Mayhem said at the time, black metal is something all ordinary mortals should fear, not make into a trend. They got pissed off at our shows, and that is what we want. If someone doesn't like blood and rotten flesh thrown on their face, they can fuck off, and that is exactly what they do. And all of this was so shocking that it became like a legitimate mainstream news story. It made headlines all over the world. I remember reading about it on the early internet back when I was in high school, probably around 1995 or so, and it was just like incredibly fascinating to me that this stuff was actually happening halfway across the world.
It's called black metal music and encourages devil worship and the desecration of churches.
And it's easy to understand why it was such a captivating story at the time. It was really like a more extreme version of the Satanic Panic that happened in the 80s. This is when bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest were accused of promoting some sort of sinister satanic agenda and literally put on trial for it.
So, are these rock bands doing the devil's work?
And in hindsight, the idea that Iron Maiden were like the ringleaders of some satanic cult was completely absurd. But in the case of Burzum and Mayhem and some of those other bands, it was actually kind of true. They were like the authentic version of what all those parents in the 80s were afraid of. As King from Gorgoroth said, "When we present things to an audience, it's the message that's important, not the music. Everything leads back to our main agenda. It's spreading the word of Satan or Satan himself." And as we've seen from the popularity of true crime content over the past few years, people are naturally drawn to these sort of dark, violent stories. In psychology, there's actually a concept called negativity bias, which, to put it simply, means that our brains are programmed to pay more attention to and remember negative things more than positive things. It's the same reason that there's all these YouTube channels that get millions and millions of views documenting gang wars and beef between different rappers. And I'm sure Varg would be horrified to hear me say this, but the appeal and fascination with second wave black metal actually reminds me a lot of modern street rap. For example, the song The Race by Tay-K, which was recorded while he was on the run from the police. He was wanted for being involved with a home invasion murder before going on the run from the police and writing a song about it, before eventually getting caught and sentenced to 55 years in prison.
It might be that the song is used to show that, look, right? He knew he'd been charged. He was on house arrest. He cut off his ankle monitor, fled the jurisdiction, right? And look, this song indicates he thought he was guilty.
And so in a lot of ways, I feel like black metal was really just the precursor to the modern era of street rap, where the artists are these like larger than life characters in a true crime story, and their music is kind of just the soundtrack to that. And since then, the lore around that era of Norwegian black metal has only grown, with several documentaries covering it, for example, Until the Light Takes Us, and many different books about it, including the highly criticized Lords of Chaos, which was even made into a Hollywood feature film a couple years ago.
Do it.
And so if you think about it, it really makes perfect sense that media outlets like Vice would cover this, because they make documentaries about both street rap and black metal, because they're really both flip sides of the same coin. There's also the aesthetics, the corpse paint, the spikes, and that super high contrast black and white artwork. And regardless of what you think about the music, or how much you may disagree with the things that black metal bands believe in, I mean, let's be real, their aesthetic is fucking cool, right? For example, I think A Blaze in the Northern Sky by Darkthrone is legitimately one of the best album covers of all time. It's just so genuinely unsettling and creepy. It makes you feel like you're looking out the window and you just like catch a glimpse of a vampire or something. I think this aesthetic is especially powerful when you compare it to what came before, which was the thrash and death metal style of cover art that was all about these like super detailed, really colorful oil paintings by people like Dan Seagrave and Ed Repka. And I love both those guys and their work, but by the early 90s, that style had been imitated to death and just completely run into the ground. And the black metal aesthetic was the exact opposite of what they were doing. It was really crude and colorless and cold. And because it was so simple and high contrast, all the black metal imagery was actually far more legible than that super complex multicolored death metal artwork. Like, I think all that black metal stuff is legitimately great graphic design and illustration from a purely like textbook perspective. And so I completely understand why black metal was so captivating back in the 90s and why people continue to be fascinated with that era of the genre. But what's interesting is that all that media interest that was seen by literally tens of millions of people has never really translated into people actually listening to the music. For example, some of the biggest, most respected legacy artists in the genre, like Emperor or Dimmu Borgir, or some of the newer ones like Zeal and Ardor, all have less than 500,000 monthly listeners, compared to, say, Slipknot, who as of now are sitting at 12 million. And obviously part of that is due to the music itself, which was really deliberately inaccessible and hard to listen to, which again was by design. The Norwegian bands who felt like metal should be this elite thing for a small circle of people who are really willing to suffer to be part of it, they'd become disgusted with what the thrash and death metal scenes had become. They thought the music was too polished and technical, with lyrics that touched on completely unmetal things like introspection and self-improvement or ecology. Which, according to them, was terrible because that would attract too many people who were posers. And again, because they wanted metal to be this elite thing that only a small number of really dedicated people participated in, they said, fuck that, we're gonna make the most raw, nasty shit that we can. Which personally, I completely respect. I wouldn't necessarily choose to listen to, say, early Marduk, but I do sincerely respect any artist that has that kind of crystal clear dedication to making art that's difficult to consume and really designed to deliberately alienate and push away casual fans. And people might be surprised to hear that because I've praised pop and so forth so many times, but what it comes down to is that I'm a purist. I want music or art in general to either be the most polished, accessible thing it can possibly be, like Ariana Grande or something on one end, or I want it to be the most avant-garde, repellent, inaccessible thing you can imagine. What I don't respect is art or music that just plays it down the middle, that doesn't commit to one extreme or the other. And so I actually deeply respect the black metal bands that explicitly said, if you aren't aligned with our specific worldview and what we think this subculture should be, then fuck off. We don't want you here. And so to me, that's really the essence of second wave black metal and the bands who came after them that took inspiration from that. Like basically antagonizing the entire world outside their circle of friends, including the rest of the metal scene. And that's not exactly a recipe for popularity or commercial success, right? And yet, despite that, black metal as a genre has actually had shocking longevity. I would argue that in a lot of ways, even though thrash metal at its peak was probably 100 times more popular, I would say black metal has been more relevant than thrash metal for the past 30 years. And it's certainly gotten far more media attention than pretty much any other genre of metal. In the early early 90s second wave of black metal was certainly the defining period for the genre, but what's really interesting to me is how much longevity it's had since then. Like, there's probably literally dozens of subgenres of black metal now at this point, like war metal, depressive suicidal black metal, folk black metal. I think you could argue that dungeon synth came from black metal because I think Mortiz basically invented that. And it may not get the headlines that it did back in the 90s, but I think overall black metal now is a much bigger, healthier scene than it was back then. And there are some really cool, interesting artists like Reverorum Ib Malakt taking the sound of black metal to entirely new places. So to bring it all home, what is the secret to the appeal of black metal? A genre designed almost specifically to be unappealing. Well, I think the answer depends on who you're talking about. For, I guess you could say, the casual fans, it's pretty simple. To them, black metal is just a spectacle. It's something like Juggalos or the Tiger King that they can basically use as the punchline for a joke.
Do you want a balloon? Take a balloon, take a balloon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so, to some extent, exactly what the original second wave bands feared has become true. To some extent, pop culture has swallowed and co-opted black metal. Like Death Heaven popping up in the keynote for the launch of the iPhone 5C, or all the incredibly unfunny black metal parody shirts that you see on Facebook and Redbubble or whatever. And maybe some of the casuals who go a little bit deeper and watch something like Until the Light Takes Us, in the same way as they might watch the latest serial killer documentary on Netflix, or some YouTube video about Chicago gang beefs. But the casuals, by definition, don't actually like black metal. They don't actually listen to the music, go see the bands, or otherwise participate in the culture. Which is why, like I said, even the biggest black metal bands like, say, Dimmu Borgir or Behemoth struggle to crack 500,000 Spotify listeners. The truth is that honestly, not that many people actually like black metal. But the black metal scene is totally fine with that. To put it in engineering terms, that's a feature, not a bug. As Dead from Mayhem said, some imagine for some weird reason that metal is something normal and available for everyone. Death/black metal is something all ordinary mortals should fear, not make into a trend. And so when Watain plays a show and throws pig's blood and animal carcasses into the crowd, they're not trying to entertain you. They're basically saying, posers, get the fuck out. As they put it, Watain is a satanic band. It is based upon sinister energy, and thus our live shows manifest accordingly. We build upon the stage a temple of panic, chaos, magic, and death, showing to the audience the true ugly face of the horrible abomination that is black metal. And obviously, as soon as the pig's blood starts getting thrown around, most people are going to leave the room, because that's a little bit more than they bargained for. But for the people who aren't terrified or disgusted by that, or by any of the other genuinely unhinged behavior in the black metal scene, all of that is just a reminder that actually they're in the right place. Because for better or worse, what it comes down to is that black metal is one of the last true genres of outsider music. The true believers of black metal, these are not normal people. They're people who feel completely alienated by mainstream culture and even by most of metal culture. And people who feel that alienated, understandably, oftentimes become bitter and want to lash out and destroy the dominant culture that they feel like has no place for them. Like G.G. Allin or the Unabomber, for example. And I don't personally feel that way, but I can understand why somebody might. And the thing is that when it comes to metal specifically, they aren't wrong. The rest of the metal scene is kind of safe and watered down. You've got metalcore bands doing Taylor Swift covers. There's barricades at shows and security guards to keep people from getting hurt. There's Slipknot shirts at Target, or the fact that you can buy Deicide vinyl on Amazon and have it delivered overnight to you with Prime shipping. If you think about it, they kind of have a point, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying that any of that is a bad thing. In general, I want everyone to be safe and feel comfortable, and I think it's cool that people everywhere have access to all this stuff. But I do think it's true that metal isn't really threatening or scary anymore. If anything, it's almost kind of cute. And you can think what you want about black metal fans. I know they certainly don't like me. But in a world where it feels like everyone is chasing money and clout and so few people just want to make art for its own sake, there's a part of me that actually appreciates the elitists and true cultists for keeping black metal what it is, which is one of the last true genres of outsider art in metal. Sure, there's stuff like Agalloch or Wolves in the Throne Room or Alcest that's accessible and happy to, I guess, cooperate with the normie world, but I can't ever see a world in which Havahedge or Reverorum Ib Malakt are pulling a Death Heaven and playing Coachella with Calvin Harris and Ice Cube, and I respect that. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get access to all my videos and podcasts early. There are members-only VIP channels in my Discord that I'm super active in. I do giveaways sometimes, and there is a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool to you, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.